Man, we got a lot to go through today. I've got 50 slides and we got like 50 minutes and I don't know that we can do it. So I'll apologize up front. We'll get real close to that 1 o'clock time frame. I do have a couple of slides built in for some Q&A, trying to keep those questions specific to the content that was most recently addressed would be appreciated. And as some of you are aware, I'm more than happy to stick around after the presentation. I do need to depart by 2 p.m. but I'm more than willing to stick around afterwards for question and answers as necessary as well. So hopefully you had the opportunity to read some of the content here. I'm not going to go through each of the slides specifically. Some of it's going to be there for your reading pleasure as well, but we'll get going here. So this is some new information, and I wanted to start off intentionally talking about enrollment because there's been a lot of questions about enrollment, and enrollment really plays a huge factor in the amount of resources that both come into the school district and unfortunately depart the school district as well. So school board members may recall that the district undertook an enrollment study mid last fall. That was recently completed earlier this month. My apologies to the board members because they haven't even seen this yet, so they're seeing it with you all at the same time. Literally, we got the final study last week, and I'm like, I gotta incorporate some of these slides into here. So it really speaks to where we're at in the district. You know, we've had declining enrollment. That's likely to continue per the enrollment study. Not why you think, though, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Certainly there are other educational opportunities that impact the students and where they go, open enrollment, the Lincoln Academy, other voucher, charter, private schools as well. But really more importantly, when you read the enrollment study, it talks about declining birth rates, family sizes are shrinking, household number of individuals in a household are getting smaller, ages of household members are growing. So we have that aging population. And really, we also have a stagnant residential market with regards to real estate, new construction, and of course just turnover as well. So all of those factors contribute. And I would almost contend, and I think the demographer that helped facilitate the study would say that that last bullet point is really more a factor of what's going on with the enrollment within the School District of Beloit than the middle bullet factor there. So I pulled some charts from that enrollment study. This is a chart here that talks a little bit about both the enrollment over time and then the open enrollment impact as well. So of course the total enrollment, that blue solid line at the top, reflects the enrollment history for the School District of Beloit. And you can see there if you look across, you know, relatively stable from that 2012-2013 year through 2016-17 school years. Outgoing open enrollment was inching up in those years, and you can see that in the orange bars below. But the decline in enrollments really began to happen in the 2017-18 school year, and you'll note there that there was a loss of approximately 180 students that year. Don't know why, to be honest with you, don't really care. It's in our past. I'm more concerned about going forward. We really see a sharp fall off in the 2020-21 school year. That's not just reflective of the School District of Beloit, that's reflective of school districts throughout the state and quite honestly the nation as well. Keep in mind that that was during those pandemic years and the enrollment in public education experienced just a significant decline thereafter. Continued declines then thereafter in enrollment, though perhaps at a little bit more modest pace. So we'll talk about that as well. Again, the orange bars at the bottom reflect the open enrolled out students. And you know, you might suspect that, boy, there's got to be a strong correlation between declines and the open enrollments, and to some extent you can see a little bit of that. But really when I look at this over the last 4 years in particular, 2020-21 through the 23-24 school year, our open enrollment out is relatively plateaued, around 900 students outgoing. That's an issue in and of itself, you know, no doubt about that. But it's not like we've experienced, you know, 100, 200, a significant number of new students open enrolling out. Here's a slide from my professional organization, the Wisconsin Association of School Business Officials, and it talks about declining enrollment over time. My intention of injecting this slide in here is simply to point out again that this is not a School District of Beloit issue. This is a reflection of enrollment throughout the state of Wisconsin, and you can see, you know, falling by over 52,000 students since the 2011-12 school year. We just have fewer kids to educate, is the bottom line amount. And the best way to reflect that is when we look at Beloit Health Systems data. So earlier this year, Brad Bull, my colleague from Beloit Turner, and I reached out to Beloit Health and said, boy, we're really interested in knowing the number of live births that you have locally. Is there any data that you can provide to us based on zip codes of the parents of those new babies? And they graciously did that for us. And you can see the history here. And of course, the why we asked for it is because these new kids, 4 years later, are going to be entering our 4K program, either in the School District of Beloit, Beloit Turner, Parkview, Clinton, whatever. So it's great data for us to have. And when we started to look at it, we're like, wow, look at that. In 2016, Beloit gave birth to 508 babies. But yet if you scroll forward to 2023, they did 312. That's a pretty significant decline. That's more than a third decline. And then when you look at the bottom bar, the blue bar for the Beloit zip codes, again, very much parallels, 359 babies in the 2016 calendar year down to 224. Again, a reduction of about 35%. So that goes to show, the School District of Beloit's enrollment issues aren't necessarily because people are exiting the district to go elsewhere. It's because we're just having fewer kids. Now, this slide's got a lot of data on it. Let's talk about the chart first. We'll come back over to the right-hand side of the numbers in just a minute. So this takes a look at the open enrollment ins and outs. Those students that reside in the School District of Beloit, but perhaps pursue open enrollment and are attending at one of our neighboring districts or elsewhere, reflective in that orange bars. And then, of course, the incoming, which is reflective in the blue bars there. So you can see a pretty wide disparity. Yeah, it is what it is. From my perspective, it's not good. It's not what you want to see, but it is what it is. Most importantly, and you can see down here on the bottom where some of our kids, Beloit resident students are attending. Beloit Turner, 501 students going their direction. Janesville School District, almost 150 going there. I was surprised by that. I wouldn't have thought it would have been that high. Clinton, just over 100. Other districts as well, totaling just over 150, 160 or so. Coming over to the right-hand side, so we got 913 students outgoing. We have 112 students incoming, so we have a net loss of 801 students. Each one of those students this year carries a cost of $8,618 for open enrollment. So when you calculate that all out, my point here is that that bottom number in red, 6.9 million, is our outgoing annual expense, or approximate annual expense, lost revenue from the School District of Beloit to support the education of these students in other districts. And we'll carry that forward just a little bit further. And the business official colleagues that are in the room tonight, today, and thank them for coming. They're familiar with this kind of screenshot. So in June of every year, the state of Wisconsin, the DPI, gives us a state aid adjustment worksheet that helps distribute money. So, the School District of Beloit doesn't physically write a check to Beloit Turner. We don't physically write a check to Clinton. We don't do that to Parkview. The state says, hey, you know what? We'll make life more efficient for everybody. We'll figure it out on the back end, and we'll just tell you how much is going where. So you'll see the history here. And if we look at the 22-23 actual net open enrollment tuition expense, 6.2 million. We have students attending Wisconsin parental choice programs that cost the district about 1.4 million. We have some students that are enrolled in the Wisconsin Challenge Academy as cadets with the Wisconsin National Guard. That generates, it's around $125,000 a year. And then independent charter school expenses as well, just over almost 4,150,000. More importantly is that bottom number down in the lower right-hand corner. Almost $12 million worth of district revenues go out our door as expenses to support the educational needs of students attending the district elsewhere. That contributes to some of our financial challenges. A quick stop to ask if there's any questions regarding enrollment before we get into the next section. Seeing none, I'll continue on. That's great, thank you. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how we fund schools. We'll talk about the revenue limits. We'll talk about some budget overviews. This section will be a little bit longer. I think hopefully it'll answer some questions. We're going to start a little bit by taking a look at some state education funding. And those of you that were in attendance 2 weeks ago when Jason Stein from the Wisconsin Policy Forum was here, this was a slide of his, and I'm like, I like that slide. I'm bringing that in to utilize for this process as well. So it talks a little bit about the ongoing education spending and that it's slowed throughout the state. You can see, Wisconsin ranked 11th highest in per pupil spending. It's been downhill since then. More importantly, that chart on the left-hand side, the light blue line there reflects per pupil spending national average, and then the dark blue line is reflective of Wisconsin. And you can see Wisconsin was always higher than the national average until that 2016-ish year thereabout, and thereafter we've been outpaced by what's going on with our state colleagues in other states. Again, 2002, Wisconsin ranked 11th in per pupil spending throughout the nation. In 2020, we were 25th. Note the comment in the middle that that's the largest drop of any state, and that was before the 21-23 state biennial budget, which provided local school districts no new dollars to provide our operations. It was in that biennial budget process that the state legislature essentially said, why should we give you more resources from the state when you have this influx of federal money, pandemic relief funds? Use that to stabilize your budget. Business officials hated to do it, but we really had no other choice. And again, another reflection, 11% above the national average in 2002, 5.6% below just 18 years later. That's a 2020 figure. It's 2024. I can guarantee you we're worse off today than we were then. I just don't have the specifics for it. Another slide that I pulled from WASBO, my state affiliation, that talked about K-12 state aids as a share of general purpose revenue at the state level. And you can see back in 2003, the state contributed 43.1% of GPR to fund public education. And then here we are in 2023 at 36.6%. Education has fallen, I love the statement that's there, education has fallen as a state budget priority. There's limited resources, there's always limited resources. State legislature has to prioritize those resources. I might even refer to it as perhaps a change in philosophy of supporting education on a statewide basis. But it is what it is, and we try to carry on. Again, another slide that Jason Stein presented just 2 weeks ago, talking about the state caps on revenues being outpaced by inflation here. So a couple of things to point out. One, on the left-hand side is a depiction of an attempt to explain the revenue limit. And there, the revenue limit really combines two factors. It combines state aids and it combines your local property taxes. The revenue limit calculation actually determines the maximum amount of money that we can use locally. And then it's distributed amongst state aid and property taxes based on the formula. But more importantly here is take a look at the chart on the right-hand side. So that light blue line reflects the consumer price index, the growth in the CPI through the years. That dark blue line reflects state funding. And just take note at how they don't align. There's disparities or gaps in certain years, including the most recent couple of years. This slide speaks to the general school district revenues per pupil lagging behind the inflation. So the revenue limit used to be tied to the CPI. As consumer price index increased back in the 1990s, revenues would also increase accordingly, and thus you wouldn't have this disparity that's growing. However, there was an effort, it was more than an effort, it came to be, to disjoin those things so that then CPI is allowed to increase at a greater rate than what we are receiving from the state. And you can see the disparity in the growing gap there, to the point of, if it had been aligned to CPI throughout the years, that would have provided $3,380 more per pupil to public schools throughout the state to educate our students. So it just kind of goes to show how much is missing here. Another quick comment before I move off from this, and this will kind of bring it back to the 23-24 budget. Our revenues this year as a district within the revenue limit went up by 3.7%. So you may have recalled that the district recently went through a bargaining session with our employee groups, and we essentially imposed, because we couldn't reach agreement with the Beloit Education Association. The BEA originally asked for 10% in their original proposal. The board started at 2%. CPI was 8%. The board ultimately came to the position that they were willing to impose a 4.07% increase on staff, both certified teaching staff and all staff for that matter. But again, even the 4.07 is greater than the 3.7% additional revenues that the district received. So, you know, how do we award and retain our staff and thank them at an 8% level when our revenue limits are only increasing by 3.7? And that was just this year. The 2 years prior, the district had no increases in our revenue limits. So that then all leads to this, the operating referendum. You're just going to get a couple of quick slides, and we'll come back to this in about 20 minutes probably. So, boy, the number of operating referendums has just really expanded through the years. Somewhat by design. I don't know if it was by intent, but I can recall back in the days in the 90s in particular, where the question was asked, well, how are school districts going to be able to do this if they need more money? And the governor at the time essentially said, well, there's always this referendum opportunity that school districts can pursue. And boy, did school districts pursue. So you can see the increased use of operating referendum through the years. The prevalence of districts seeking an operational referendum override to their revenue limitations just continues to grow. And again, referring to a slide from Jason from the Wisconsin Policy Forum a couple of weeks ago, the districts respond by going to referendum. As of 2022, over half the districts in the state had gone to referendum at least once in 2020. School District of Beloit was not included in that yet because our first referendum question was April of 23. And then again, over 2/3 of Wisconsin school districts had passed at least one referendum in the last 7 years. When I came to the School District of Beloit and I kind of looked into the history and I identified that the district had only gone to referendum question 4 times in the last 30 years, and 2 of them were capital related, I was amazed. I kind of understood, but that kind of pointed towards a challenge. And then of course, our referendum question from April of 23 is listed there. That unfortunately was defeated by 406 votes. I'll point out that 406 is really only 203 voters, because if you had 203 no voters that would have voted yes, the referendum question would have passed by 1. Another story, but that's for a different time. So this is our revenue limit formula. The business officials, the district administrators, they'll all appreciate this. It's a complicated mess. It's hard to explain. To really do it justice, we'd be here for about a half hour, 45 minutes just talking about this. So we're not going to get into it a lot. It's a multi-page formula that helps us determine what the maximum revenue limit authority is. It identifies the state aid values and then the resulting allowable revenue limit for taxation purposes. I'll note again that school business officials like myself, it's kind of budget development time. This time of year, we're all starting to work on our 24-25 school district budgets already. We'll likely run and recompute this formula 3, 6, 8 times over the next 5 to 6 months, trying to go through and just calculate and make sure that we got it right. Things become known, we go back in and we adjust the values, and when we adjust values, it adjusts the bottom line. So we play with this formula a number of times throughout the budget development process. This slide here, again, borrowed from Jason a couple of weeks ago, talks about the School District of Beloit's revenue limit now being below the state average. And you can see the state average there in that orange line. And for the most part, I would say through the years, the School District of Beloit was relatively tight to approaching that line, a couple of times even hitting the line or exceeding the line. But more importantly, over the last 3 or so years, you can see that gap just widening further, and that's not a good sign. Another chart here talking about the maximum revenue per member. This includes exemptions, and again, the state is reflective there in the orange bar, and then the district is in the blue with the diamond data points there as well. And again, you really look at it, right, and look at those last 4 or so years. That gap just kind of continues to widen. And when that widen occurs, we really feel the pain points. I'm going to stop before I get into the next session. This wasn't planned, but I'm going to do a quick pause and just ask if there's any questions at this point in time that I can address. Hearing none, seeing none, we'll continue on. All right, so now we're going to get into some of the 23-24 budget specifics in particular. So the accounting, the numbers people in the room, they're probably well familiar with fund accounting, and that's kind of a governmental accounting practice. So I just wanted to highlight some of our major funds, and you can see those listed there on the left-hand side. Fund 10, our General Operation Fund. That's where the lion's share, the majority of our activity, of course, takes place. Fund 27, Special Education Fund, are the resources necessary to support those students with IEPs, individual education plans that identify those services. Fund 38 and 39 are our debt service funds, non-referendum and referendum approved debt service funds. Fund 50, our food service fund. Fund 99, some other cooperative packaging. And more importantly, perhaps, is just look at the bottom line, right? Our grand total expenses. And if you look at that across the years, note that you have 5 years of history, and then to the right, this current school year. But if you look at that across the years, it's been relatively stable in that low 120, to mid 120 million in expenses. A couple of notations of years, 2020, 21, 128 million, 21, 22, 130 million, and you're probably wondering, well, what causes those increases? Keep in mind that those are years that we have federal pandemic relief funds, ESSER grants, CARE Act, and those sorts of grants that were infused into the district, and then, we couldn't necessarily supplant. Sometimes you have to add expenses then to generate that, and that then all increases your expenses there. But more importantly, again, our expenditures are relatively stable. Some may say that amount is high, but again, relatively stable through the years. Another slide up in the upper left-hand side that Jason had from the Wisconsin Policy Forum, talking about where state revenues were on a percentage basis back in 2020 throughout the state. And you can see state revenues reflected almost 55%. On the lower right-hand side, you'll see sources of revenue for the School District of Beloit here in the 23-24. So whereas state resources a couple of years ago was 55%, School District of Beloit receives about 71% of our revenue that come from the state sources. Federal revenues on the end, statewide a few years back, about 6.5%. For the School District of Beloit, 18.5%. Now, one of the causes for that influx or that big spike here, the 18.5%, back in 2020, there wasn't a lot of federal pandemic relief ESSER grants yet flowing into school districts. So that helps contribute to that jump on the federal. But more importantly, let's look at the bars in the middle, right? Because that's really what's most important, and that's a reflection on our local revenues. So the statewide, back in 2020, about 39% of revenues that operated school districts was generated at the local level through the local property tax. Here in the School District of Beloit in this current year, less than 11%. Taking a look at our general fund, Fund 10 revenues by source, 71% of it coming from the state, 17% from the federal government, about 10% from local, and then there's a little bit of some minor percentages elsewhere. If we look at special education funding, a little bit different story, 27.5% coming from the state, about 14% coming from the feds, but more importantly, we got this huge percentage, 58, almost 59% of the revenues necessary to support special education funding are essentially an inter-fund transfer where we take money from Fund 10 and bring it into Fund 27. So we're taking money that's available for all kids within the district and applying those resources to a much more limited number of special ed students. But that's how it operates. So some data here looking at revenue sources for the 23-24 school year. You can see on the left-hand side is a description followed by general fund revenues, what's in Fund 27, what the total is, and then on the far right, the percentage of budget. And let's just start over there. So, you know, you'll see that 70.7%, almost 71% coming from the two sources there, state general aid, and then all other state sources. And when we add in the federal revenues immediately below that, now we're jumping up over 89% of our revenues come from either state or federal. And more importantly, if we go back up to the 211 tax levy row, you can see there 8.7% of our revenues is generated by the local property tax. So we talked real quick about where the money comes from and how the revenues come in. Let's talk about where those revenues go. So there's our expenses by function. This captures both Fund 10, our general fund, and Fund 27, our special education fund. You can see on the right, instruction incorporating about 43%, instructional support down here. At the bottom of the chart, 15%, facilities, transportation, business, almost 16% there, cost to operate stuff. If you look at the top, you know, it started at the top at charter school payments and then work our way back by those three pieces of the pie chart. Again, that's at approximately $17 million that's going outside the district to educate School District of Beloit residents attending elsewhere. So that's a rather large piece of the pie, so to speak. We'll get into a lot more specifics, trying to stay at a higher level here. Again, just looking at expenses by object here in the current 23-24 school year, same type of reporting, looking at general fund, special ed, total, and the percent. You can look across the board, you know, again, salaries and benefits, that's about 60%, and that 60% is actually low. Typically, salaries and benefits in a public education system are going to run about 75 to 80%. So why is ours low? Ours is low because when we look down at some of our purchase services, you know, we're paying that about $16 million to other educational entities to support our students going elsewhere. That's reported in that 300 purchase service lines. About half of that value is attributed to that. But those monies that are going to Parkview, to Turner, to Clinton, even to the Lincoln Academy, Rock County Christian School, they're not going to those educational institutions necessarily to build. Those resources are going to pay for staff, salary and benefits, to fill those classrooms for our students that are getting there. So when you really look at, if we took that 15% and we added it to the 60% of our internal staffing, now we're at 75%, and that kind of connects the dots between the difference with the School District of Beloit and other school districts. So I like to look at history, and I think it's a good, you know, to have some perspective. You know, I come in new, I come with my own experiences, my own vision, my own questions, much like many of you have. You know, we start digging into numbers, we find things, we discover things. But I like to reflect back also, you know, so again, we look at the 5-year history in some of these major objects, and then over on the right in that yellow highlighted column is our current year budget. And just out of curiosity, I'm like, you know, so what's happened with salaries through the years? You know, they've gone up, you would expect that. They haven't really gone up significantly in my mindset. I mean, it's remained relatively stable. You know, employee benefit costs, another one. You know, again, relatively stable. You can go down almost any of those rows and see pretty good evidence of stability. And again, if we come down to the general fund, looking at expenses at the very bottom, it's not surprising. It is higher, but it's not running wild, like I think many people in the public may try to lead others to believe. So again, just an opportunity to be reflective and look back through the years And now let's get specifically into 23-24 expenditures. And we'll take a look at each of those major objects as we go down. So we're going to start by looking at salary and benefits here. This captures our Fund 10 General Fund, Fund 27 Special Education Fund. Nearly 67 million, approximately 65% of the budget. You know, our February 2nd payroll was 789 individuals, just to kind of put that in perspective for people. You know, each payroll runs approximately $1.2 million for the school district. Our employee benefits are very comparable to other districts. It's not like our benefits are rich when we look around, because we do those comparisons, you know, very stable. And most importantly, not surprising probably to anybody, there's just labor challenges, right? I mean, unfortunately, the School District of Beloit has current vacant positions. If anybody's looking for a job, more than happy to speak to you afterwards, because we've got opportunities as well, much like everybody else does here, likely also. So let's take a look at that second largest area of spending, purchase services. You know, again, this exceeds 33 million, but again, almost 17 million this year is budgeted to support the cost of resident students being educated elsewhere, either through open enrollment, independent charter schools, Challenge Academy, etc. Some of the other major areas here, pupil transportation runs about $2.7 million a year. We do have a contracted custodial service that runs approximately $3 million a year. Utilities, approximately $1.5 million annually. There's opportunities, you know, to try to be more efficient there, you know, to try to squeeze the turnip a little bit more, and we'll work on that, of course. I kind of grouped the rest of them, the rest of these major objects, into an all other expenditures category, because they're just big picture, relatively insignificant. I mean, the dollar values are there, but you know, where these dollars are used is to support classroom supplies, curricular resources like textbooks, instructional media, technology, hardware and devices, property, liability, workers' comp insurance, insurance coverages, etc. The big takeaway I would encourage people to look at here is, you know, we're looking at what, probably about $4 million here in total spending. Don't get me wrong, 4 million is a lot of money, but in the grand scheme of things, with $120 million budgets, it's rather tight. Anybody want to know what we did with our federal ESSER grant money? Raise your hand. Yeah, all right, yeah, there's some hands. Okay, good, thanks. So these federal pandemic relief grants, you know, grants are grants, and everybody interprets grants as free money. Here's a grant, do whatever you want with it, have fun. And that's never the case. Grants are really restricted to permissible uses. The grant resources can only be used to support activities that align with the grant allowable costs and restrictions. So it's rather controlled. There's some flexibility, but still some tight controls. The other thing I'd like to point out about these federal pandemic relief grants in particular, that these are limited grants. These are one-time grant resources that are provided to school districts, and most typically, they are aligned to support similar one-time expenditures, not expenses that would be recurring from one year to another. When such grant resources are allocated to these recurring expenditure activities like staffing, that creates a huge challenge, often referred to as a fiscal cliff, that when those grant resources go away, which these ESSER grants will by no later than September 30th, and likely sooner for the School District of Beloit, we won't have those resources any longer. Earlier, you heard me speak that back in the 21-23 state biennial budget, the state legislature provided no additional resources to fund public education, and the legislature in particular said, use your ESSER grants to stabilize your budget, which we did. But again, as those ESSER funds are expired and used and consumed, that leaves a hole in the budget that needs to be backfilled, which leads to some of our referendum questions later. So let's talk a little bit about how and where the resources were spent. It was a great question that resonated in the community. Early when I got here, you know, I kind of pay attention. I got that eyes group on my phone. I look at it a couple of times. It's important to know what they say. I don't, but again, you know, so we tried to answer the question to the best of our abilities. So what we did is, we did this back in mid-October, I think. We updated this chart, or these charts plural, to describe where the funds were being utilized. We tried to provide some generalities. You know, some people may say we need more specifics. You know, boy, we can do the more specifics, but it takes so precious staff time and resources away from what we really need to be focusing on, and that's going forward, and perhaps less so on what's going back. But more importantly, this is our ESSER 1. The grant period was from March 13th of 2020 through September 30th of 2022. And you can see our total allocation at the top, just under $2.3 million. In the green row at the bottom, just under $2.3 million actually spent and claimed. There is that little bit left. What is that, about $6, $8? I can't tell. A little bit went unspent. Trust me, it wasn't the School District of Beloit that unspent those resources. These grants also required us to share some of this with our parochial local school partners. And those, through that process, one of them, whoever, decided they were close enough and they weren't concerned about the less than $10 that was left. Unfortunately, we can't claim that because it was allocated to the parochial school partners. So this is our ESSER 2 grant award, just over $8.4 million. Extended the grant period for an additional year to September 30th of 2023. And again, you can see on the far right in that lower corner, $8.4 million, and again, a little bit that was unspent, again, allocated to our local parochial partners. Perhaps most importantly is our ESSER 3 funds, $18.8 million allocated to the district. This grant runs through the end of September of this current year. And you can see we currently have spent about half of it. What we've currently claimed, we've spent more. We have to submit claims to the Department of Public Instruction. They have to review it, approve it, and then they finally pay it to us. But we've got about half of that grant amount actually received back as part of claims. So again, this information, so this one here was just updated as of January 31st. The two prior presentations for 1 and 2 go through, or were updated as of June 30th of 23, if I recall correctly. Number 1 and number 2 were posted to the district's website at that location there back in October of 23. And ESSER grant number 3 was just updated within the past week or two as we got the new data. And Brooke, my grants coordinator, is here. She doesn't know it yet, but we'll be updating this every 3 months between now and really when it's all gone. So thanks, Brooke. Pause real quick for budget-related question and answers. Man, I'm going through a lot and I apologize for the time. Yes?
Are other schools in the same situation? They have that many parochial schools out there that they're having to, I'm just curious.
Yeah, the number of parochial schools varies by district. I've worked in districts that have had none. And I've worked, this I think is, yeah, this is the district I think that I've had the most in. So that varies. But oftentimes when federal grants are awarded, there needs to be certain percentages set aside for various grants to support the needs of those students attending a parochial school as well. So, yeah. I thought I saw, yes, sir.
Could you go back maybe 12 or 15 slides? Where you showed, yeah, where you showed the gross expenditures year by year for salaries and benefits and so on.
That one?
Wouldn't it be more accurate to do that on a per capita basis?
Yes.
Yeah, it certainly could be done in that
What
fashion.
would that show, generally?
Yeah. Yeah, it could be done. You know, another interesting thing would be to overlay the number of students that we have, right? You know, into these slides as well. So, you know, I could go way back to one of the first slides that showed our student enrollment declining. Nobody disputes that. The data says what the data says. I've yet to really identify a good, strong, reliable data source that I can rely upon to see where staffing aligns to our student enrollment numbers. My gut tells me that it's been relatively stable, perhaps even declining slightly. But the challenge is that the decline in staffing likely does not parallel the decline in enrollment. And that's hard in school business purposes. I often refer back to, this comes from my small school backgrounds, but let's say we had 24 students in a school district, 24 fewer students in a school district. So people always say, well, I mean, that's kind of a classroom, right? So you need one fewer teacher, and well, you probably don't need that bus route either. But the exit of 24 students in a district come over 14 grades, not in one section of one class. They didn't all come out of section C of 3rd grade. Because then if it was that easy, we'd just get rid of the section C teacher at 3rd grade and say, we don't need you anymore, sorry. But they come out of 14 grade levels, and they don't all ride the same bus route. So, trying to reduce expenses and align staffing and services to your students is a bit more challenging. Hopefully that answers, and if not, I'm more than happy to stay afterwards. Tom, can I come back to you so we can continue on? Is that all right? Thank you. Apologies and thank you. So let's talk about property tax levy and impacts, trying to wrap this up as close as we can to 1 o'clock. So here's kind of a snippet or a screenshot of the tax levy and the mill rate computation. This is the revenue limit. It's kind of the lower right-hand portion. My colleagues know exactly where this is found. I want to walk through this with you real quick. So the revenue limit controls the maximum allowable revenue as referenced by line or row 13 up there. You can follow that across and see that just over $10 million. The revenue limit controls and limits the amount of available for taxation purposes to support the General Education Fund, Fund 10, in row 14A, 9.1 million, plus the amount in non-referendum debt service, Fund 38, row 14B, just under $1 million, and a capital expansion fund 41, row 14C, which we're not using currently, and I would doubt that the School District of Beloit has ever used. But the total of these levies for these 3 funds cannot exceed the allowable revenues, again, that line 13 in the top right corner. Come down, we'll talk about row 15 here. So these are revenues from other levies outside of the revenue cap. So row 14s are all within the revenue cap. Row 15 says, okay, there's probably some permissible uses for funds outside of the revenue cap, so let's talk about those. So 15A is referendum approved debt, Fund 39, you can see that value is 0. Last year it was over $11 million. So last year, we are literally within a month of prepaying the remainder of our debt that the district acquired from 2013 to build Fruzen Intermediate School and to make improvements at many of our other schools as well. So we have sufficient revenues on source to fund the prepayment on all of that, to remove that tax liability. That'll save the district, is it 575? A big amount of interest expense over the next few years. So that we won't have to incur. But because we have no referendum approved debt liability, we can't tax, we don't tax for it. Row 15 is our community service fund. That'll be used to support such services as the Blender Cafe here at Beloit Public Library, our Even Start programming, in other community needs, and perhaps a great example of a community need a bit unexpected was just a few weeks ago when the Merrill Elementary School was utilized as a community evacuation site as a result of that tire fire that many of you probably are associated with. Not huge expenses there, but appropriate expenses that we can charge to fund 80, our community service fund. 15C, prior year levy chargeback for uncollectible taxes. At times there'll be values in there. Does not appear to be the case currently to my knowledge, but sometimes you can see, some property taxpayers don't do their thing, right? So there's an opportunity for us to recoup that, make sure that we get that. And then other revenue, 15B, really from Milwaukee and Kenosha only. More importantly, line 16 is our total fall tax levy, and you can read across there and see $10.7 million. That amount then is divided by what I clipped here on the bottom, our total equalized property valuation for the school district, 2.7 billion with a B, to then determine the mill rate, which is that levy rate percentage on the lower right, of about $3.96 per $1,000 of property. Lots of calculation there. Here's kind of a history of the school district tax levy rates through the years, starting at the top, 23-24, and you can see the property tax effect on the far right in the decrease in the mill rate over time. I'll talk a little bit more about that here. This chart reflects the history of the School District of Beloit's mill rate through the years. In the business office, we love stability in the mill rate, because property taxpayers typically appreciate stability in the mill rate too. When there's stability there, you're not necessarily paying more in taxes. There are instances, you know, in what is that, fall of 2016, the mill rate dropped, went right back up the following year. And why do we like that stability? Nobody ever notices when it goes down. Nobody calls us and says, thank you. But when it goes back up, everybody's concerned about why did it go back up and everything. And then we get to the far right-hand side of the chart, right? And we see it 1010, 1010, 478, 396, not a good thing. Not good at all. And really, you know, I circled those 4 years. I've been in the business long enough, and I'll tell you, that was a missed opportunity. There was just, it never should have been allowed to go from 1010 to 478 in one fell swoop. There should have been efforts back in those years to provide property taxpayers relief, to allow that 1010 to slide to some lower value, $8, $7.50, whatever. But by doing that, would have then permitted the school district to be able to recoup revenues to help sustain our current operations. So again, it was a missed opportunity. Challenges in those years though, federal pandemic was going on, right? You know, that we had that issue. And then the contributing factor, I think, in all of this is just some lack of stability in the school business office in my role. My role was vacant for over 1.5 years before I got here. And then even some instability at the district administrator level as well. When there's turnover and when there's a lack of stability, there's not a great opportunity to align, to identify these opportunities and really strategize on how to do it and do it right the first time. In my perspective, looking at it, you know, we're going to referendum here in April of 24. I would almost contend that the School District of Beloit should have had their first operating referendum question on the ballot in April of 2020 in preparation for that decline, and again, trying to stabilize that mill rate and meet in the middle. So about 2 weeks ago, I got a phone call from an individual that said, hey, can you kind of, you know, put some perspective on this for me with regards to a property tax bill? So we did. A great suggestion. Not quite sure that I hit all of the requests on this, but I liked it. So what we did is we went back, we took a piece of property in the School District of Beloit, and we went through the years and we looked at what the total assessed value was, and more importantly, how much of the property tax bill in those years was levied for the School District of Beloit purposes, and you can see it there. 2022, of course, the assessed values went up, so that has a little bit to play with regards to the taxable amounts on the far right. But really what's more impacting the 22 and 23 values there, again, coming back to this chart, is that significant drop to 478 and 396. So increased assessment values has a role to play, but that huge decrease in the mill rate has a greater role to play. More importantly, you know, property taxpayers are paying approximately half of what they had paid in prior years. It's hard then to go back up, I get it. Everybody's a property taxpayer, right? So here's a chart. I went to the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. They have this data out there, and I wanted to refer to it and look at it and just look back over the history. This is the last 40 years. And you'll notice that the green highlighted cells there in the fall of 2023, total levy and equalized rate, if you look at those through the years, they're the lowest ever in the last 40 years. Never been lower before. Both a good thing and a bad thing. Good for property taxpayers, Not necessarily so good though for the school district then. A quick pause before we get into the last section on referendum, and I'll try to do that quickly. I see it's straight up 1 o'clock, so yeah.
I'll make it real quick. Going back to expenditures. I'm open the scab on closing 2 schools on the west side, but you said expenditures remain the same. I would have thought that part of the arguing point of closing the 2 schools would decrease our expenditures, but it hasn't. Is that true or not true?
I wouldn't say that it hasn't. I would say that it probably has, though has not decreased expenditures to the point that people would have liked. So, let's talk about closing of schools in 2 veins. One, from an efficiency standpoint, I think the 23-24 school year has shown that we can be more efficient operating in our current structure than we did last year. From a cost perspective, closing McNeil, closing Cunningham, repurposing Cunningham, moving BLA from Wright to Cunningham, and then recognizing that we could also move Even Start from Brother Dutton to Cunningham, provided savings. So we were leasing space at Brother Dutton, and I can't remember the value, rather small, like $34,000 a year, plus or minus a couple probably. Really where our savings have come from no longer utilizing 2 buildings have been in utility costs and custodial needs. We didn't have huge savings in staffing because we didn't non-renew all of those staff at those buildings. We intentionally looked at those staff and we recognized that they had value to the School District of Beloit because we had other staff that were here under an emergency license, or perhaps not appropriately licensed, filling roles. Sometimes it's better to have a person than a nobody. So what we were able to do is shift our value teachers at Cunningham and McNeil to other areas within their certification. So a year ago almost now, we non-renewed 2 individuals, but those individuals really weren't as a result of closing of either of those schools.
I don't want to belabor because I know you're short. I just want to ask expenditures. So you said there should be on the utilities and the upkeep of those, have them been realized since the closing of those schools?
Certainly so.
Okay.
Yep.
They're not reflected though in the expenditures? Then there's no dip, there's just nominal?
It would be nominal. I mean, $1.5 million total budget for the whole school district in utilities. Closing those 2 schools, one a larger school, one a smaller school, perspective-wise, it's going to be small.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You bet. All right, a couple of quick slides on the operating referendum, and then I'll open it all up for question and answer. It's been up on the screen. Hopefully you had the opportunity to read it. This is the question that'll appear on that April 2nd ballot, asking for $9 million per year for each of the next 3 school years. So let's talk about how we came to the number a little bit. Business professionals, we use a couple of different budget forecasting tools out there. This, the one that we're utilizing is our Baird budget model. In this scenario is our base scenario, and this essentially says, okay, if we take our 23-24 budget and simply cast it forward, we know, we're gonna work on some assumptions in increases in expenses and what they may be, 3, 4, 5%. How does that impact us overall? And really, if we look at those 3 columns and the rows identified there in the red circle, that's our challenge area. So we're looking at the 24-25, 25-26, 26-27 budget, and you can see across the lane here, and I hate to step away, but I'm going to do it real quick. So let's look at our total expenses: 98, 100, 102 million. Relatively stable, not exorbitant, I don't think. More importantly, let's look at our front end revenues. 98 million current year, projected at 87.8 million next year, and then we're in the 80s. So everybody's thinking, okay, why that drop? And again, that is simply a reflection of utilizing those ESSER 3 funds to stabilize our budget. Those monies are going away. There's nothing to backfill that. And again, the bottom line there, you can see $10.8 million budget deficit for the 24-25 school year, and that deficit then increases in each of the 3 school years. So then we do a model that says, okay, what happens if our operating referendum passes, asking for that $9 million on a non-recurring basis for the next 3 school years? You can see the $9 million reflected there in the non-recurring referendum column, row for those 3 columns. And then more importantly, if we look back at that same data set that we looked at, we're up $9 million in revenues, obviously because of the override authority, and more importantly, the deficit decreases by $9 million as well. The key point here is, even if the operating referendum passes, if we have the authority to use an additional $9 million, the school district still has to reduce our budget by at least $1.8 million. The $9 million doesn't provide us anything new. We can't hire a lot of new people. We can't do new things. The $9 million's not even enough for us to operate how we operate today. In order for us to do that, the request should have been $12.4 million. There wasn't any way in heck $12.4 million was gonna pass in this community as a result of the survey that we did. So we went down to what we felt was appropriate and what has the greatest opportunity for passage, and that's that $9 million mark. The other thing I'll speak to, and again, I'm gonna step away here. So we got a $1.8 million deficit next year. The deficit would grow to 2.63. These values, this is a cumulative value of deficit reductions over the years. My point is, if we make the deficit reductions individually year by year, we have to make $3.4 million over the next 3 years. My recommendation was that we make $2.6 million in reductions in the first year. Why would we make more the first year? Because then you're gonna end up with about an $800,000 surplus here. You'll have about an $800,000 deficit in year 3 that you use the surplus to apply to the deficit, and you could make it through the 3 years, but your total impact then is 2.6 instead of 3.4. So by making reductions sooner, we have the ability to save about $800,000 worth of programming instead of cutting it individually as we go. Couple more slides, and my apologies for going long. So again, the mill rate, the what happens. So we've seen this before, and you'll see it here as well. If the referendum is adopted and passed, the mill rate will climb to about $6.11, $6.72, $6.75, and hopefully then we'll have some stability there. And as much as we talk about if it passes, I gotta speak to the opposite as well. If that referendum question is defeated, you can see what happens with the mill rate then as well. It continues to decline. Coming back to that same piece of property, just kind of carrying it forward a little bit. If the referendum passes, the approximate School District of Beloit property tax impact would be reflected there in the top right, and if it's defeated, reflected in the top left. Nobody likes paying property taxes. I mean, is anybody? No. Property taxes are a reflection of the services that we believe in expect to be provided locally. Local levels of government can't provide services without some funding source to provide that. Property taxes is the means for many of our municipalities. Some people look at property taxes in a vein, and complain. I look at it almost as an investment. It's an investment in our local municipalities. It's an investment in our roads, in our healthcare, or our first responder systems, in our education systems as well. If the referendum fails, I hope it doesn't come to this, but if it does, again, we need to reduce our expenses next year by $10.8 million. That's roughly 10 to 11% of our district budget. That's a lot. That's a huge impact. The School District of Beloit will look significantly different, and you can read, kind of the wheres and the hows. Some people will say, boy, but your student achievement results, aren't where they should be. And nobody in the room's gonna, try to defend and say that's not true. I don't know how you close the gap on student achievement by doing that with $11 million less dollars than you currently have. So, if the referendum passes, we still have to make budget reductions. Again, that 1.8 to 2.6 still has to be done That $9 million essentially provides us with an opportunity to save some expenses that otherwise would have been reduced from the budget. Hey, that's all I got. It's 1:10. My apologies for going 10 minutes over. Be more than happy to take some Q&A amongst everybody. If you've got to get up and go, as some have, feel free to do that. And just so you know, I'm free until 2, and I don't plan on leaving until the last person's out the door. So if you've got questions that you want to address to me individually afterwards, I'm here for another 50 minutes. So.
I would like to personally thank Mr. Chady for his opportunity here with you all. One of the things that you also have to know, the School District of Beloit did not have a business manager for a year and a half. Okay? When I got here, that was one of my jobs and responsibilities, was to find somebody, right? And so for the first 4 or 5 months, that was Dr. Garrison. And I will say thank you to Mr. Chady for his service to the School District of Beloit since he's been here. That's a very important position in the school district, especially when you're talking about finances and the things that really impact the conversations here in our community. And so having Mr. Chady here, again, I wanted to make sure I put some things into the room for that. As Mr. Chady has just mentioned, we'll stick around for just a little bit. Again, we thank you so much for your time.
Yes.
Yeah, I haven't been following it as closely as I would like to, but I wonder if you could comment about this effort to decouple school choice funding and kind of what your view is on
Sure.
that.
Okay. Yeah. So that's been an interesting thing. We've been contacted by our friends at the Lincoln Academy about that as well. So I'll share with you my personal reflections, and please understand that this is a personal reflection, doesn't necessarily speak for the School District of Beloit.
And could you tell us what, I know it's probably very complicated, but what the decoupling means?
Sure.
Yes.
So let me see if I can fly way back to one of my early slides, because it really speaks to this process. I think I'm getting there. Oops, right here. Okay. So essentially what the efforts are, this line item here is our friends at the Lincoln Academy. So essentially what the thought process is instead of having the funding that goes to support School District of Beloit residents, students attending there, come out of our general state equalization aid, that allocation from the state be handled in a different method. So that way it removes, my words, the consternation that exists between the parties, public education and independent charter schools beyond just the Lincoln Academy. As Senator Spreitzer reached out about that, and my response to him again was, hey, this is my personal reflections, not necessarily the viewpoint of the School District of Beloit. It makes sense to remove that consternation between the parties and be able to speak more freely about things. My concern, though, is that, that's the first domino of how many thereafter, and what's domino number 2 and number 3 and number 4, and do we continue to see an increase in the state GPR funding for independent charter schools that would exceed that of public education, which has been the case for the past few years. So I think one of the motivations is to make that separation so that way there's not the consternation, but more importantly, perhaps for the independent charter schools, there's an opportunity to continue to receive more revenues at the expense of public education. Yes, sir.
This is related to that. Currently, with respect to our levy limits that we get, those Lincoln Academy kids are considered to be part of our membership.
Correct.
So the question is, with respect to whether or not this is a good idea or a bad idea, is whether or not we get more in state aid per kid than we send out to Lincoln Academy as tuition. And where is that right now?
So the value of incoming revenues for students seeking other educational opportunities outside the School District of Beloit, and the expenses that go with that, have generally been favorable to the resident district. However, that has started to change, and the outgoing expenses are generally increasing at a faster rate, so it's costing the district more. Let me
We've been kind of a net gain because we are so heavily aided.
Yeah, you can say that we have received more in aid, yeah. You know, I'll go back to my days in my school business management program 15 years ago, and it was joked upon then that your ideal school district was a school district that you didn't have any students. You had 1,000 kids and they all open enrolled out because you were collecting $10,000 per kid, but you were paying $7,000 for the kid leaving. So, you know, you had $3,000 per student, but that's changed. Again, a little bit of a philosophical thing here. You know, the legislature has started to value other educational opportunities, and you'll hear some legislators speak to the money ought to follow the student, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. But if that's the case, then the value of a student attending a private voucher program ought to be the same as attending an open enrolled opportunity, ought to be the same as going to an independent charter school. And how come is it that homeschool students don't get any funding from the state? Because if the money ought to follow the student, shouldn't those parents have resources to support the education of their children at home too? It's just a question. Other questions? Yeah.
Even if we passed it, we looked, it was gonna be a $13 million somewhere, oh, like almost toward the end.
Yeah, I'll catch up. Keep going.
It's still gonna be bad in 3 years or whatever.
It will, yes. Yeah, operating referendums. Again, referring to the analogy of a domino, it's the first one. Once you start the operating referendum process, they typically repeat themselves in 3, 5, 4 years, whatever that cycle is. When that cycle is broken, it's because a school district says no more times than not. And a great example of that would be our district to the west, the Parkview School District. We had a couple of operating referendum questions on the ballot back in 22, 23. They were defeated. They needed to make budgetary reductions in their budget for the, I think even last year, 23-24 school year, 22-23, and then this year in the 23-24 school year. And thus they're back on the ballot here in April seeking operating referendum authority. And they've got some great specifics as to how they're going to use the money, because they're using the money to bring back positions that they cut last year. So those were positions that they didn't want to let go a year ago, but they had to because they didn't have the financial resources to do that. So if our operating referendum were to fail, let's just talk about that real quick, on April 2nd, before the end of April, the school district has to provide preliminary notices of non-renewal to certified teachers. So we'll have like 3.5 weeks to do that process. That's not a fun process. I've been on a school board during that process, and I didn't sleep for like a week. And then on top of that, we still need to make other budgetary reductions prior to July 1st. So if it fails in April, may we return in November? Likely. However, you're going to have a significant hit to the school district budget before we try to, return back to seek more revenues. So, yeah.
Mr. Chady, going back to the revenue side, and the federal dollars we use for ESSER or whatever programs that came out of COVID.
Yep.
How much did that amount to in budget years this year? Is it my question is $9 million replacing that federal money?
Not fully, but probably about half, maybe a little bit more than half of the $9 million request is to kind of backfill those federal funds that are departing. Yep. Yep. And the other backfill component, honestly, again, talking about staffing, been in the business long enough. I mean, we know where the work gets done, right? The work gets done in the classroom by that teacher and by those aides to support those students. And There's not enough of those individuals in those positions, and they need to be paid, and ought to be paid and appreciated well. If we could have, we would have done more. I mean, we did a 4.07. If we had additional resources, we would have done more. So again, it also provides us that opportunity then going forward to more appropriately meet that financial need, demand of our staff as a whole. No other questions? I'll leave it at that. I'm sticking around, so if you've got individual questions, feel free. Thank you all very much for attending.